There exists, in the archived correspondence of Central Asian trade administrators from the late 19th century, a series of route reports that share an unusual quality. They are brief. They are factual. They contain no embellishment, no speculation, and no attempt to interpret what they describe. Among these documents, filed between inventories of grain shipments and weather observations, appears a term that was never explained by those who wrote it down: Almas. The word appears in reports dated to 1081, during a period when desert trade routes were expanding and becoming more systematically documented. European colonial interests, Russian expansion, and the growth of regional commerce had created a need for reliable information about terrain, safety, and travel conditions. Caravan leaders, merchants, and occasionally military observers submitted reports that were expected to be useful, not entertaining. The language was dry. The purpose was administrative. This is why the appearance of the term Almas is notable. It was not introduced with definition. It was not accompanied by folklore or local legend. It simply appeared in the middle of logistical summaries, noted alongside distances traveled, water sources identified, and expected arrival times. In some cases, it appeared as the only explanation for a route delay or a decision to alter course. The reports were not written by storytellers. They were written by men whose income depended on the predictability of their work. Exaggeration invited skepticism. Unclear language created liability. These were professionals who understood that their credibility rested on restraint, and yet the word was used. It was used more than once. It was used by different parties, traveling separately, who had no reason to coordinate their language. No one reading these reports in 1881 appears to have requested clarification. No official inquiry was launched. No follow-up questions were documented. The term was accepted, filed, and left alone. This suggests something that researchers examining the records more than a century later found difficult to dismiss. Those who read the reports at the time understood what was being referenced, or they understood that certain things did not require further discussion. The accounts were not dramatic. They did not describe attacks. They did not mention injury, theft, or confrontation. What they described, in language so restrained it borders on evasion, was presence, observation, proximity, and in some cases, the decision to leave an area without completing the intended route. The Almas was noted the way one might note a sandstorm or a dry well. It was treated as a condition, not a creature, not a legend, a condition that required adjustment. What makes these reports credible is not what they claim, but what they refuse to claim. There is no attempt to justify the fear, no effort to describe what was seen in detail. The language suggests that those writing the reports believed their readers would need no convincing. The implication is that the Almas, whatever it was, had already been established as real enough to require no defense. This restraint is inconsistent with folklore. Folklore grows. It exaggerates. It provides detail and moral structure. These reports do none of that. They function more like warnings embedded in operational language, written by people who had no interest in being memorable. They simply wanted their decisions understood. By the mid-1880s, certain routes that had been in regular use were quietly abandoned. No formal declarations were made. No dangers were officially cited. Merchants began choosing longer paths. Caravan schedules were adjusted without explanation. And in the records that remain, the word Almas appears less frequently, not because it was resolved, but because the places it was associated with were no longer being traveled. This is where the account begins. Not with an encounter, but with a pattern of avoidance that suggests an encounter had already occurred. To understand why the reports from 1881 carried weight, it is necessary to understand the world they emerged from. Desert caravans operated on repetition. Survival depended on predictability. Routes were tested over generations. Water sources were known. Rest points were established. Timing was calculated with precision because deviation from schedule often meant death. A caravan crossing Central Asian desert terrain in the late 19th century was not an adventure. It was a business operation. The men who led these crossings were professionals. Many had been traveling the same routes for decades. They knew the shape of the land, the behavior of the wind, the places where temperature dropped faster than expected. They understood how sound carried at night. They knew which animals moved at which hours and what their movement indicated about water or weather. This knowledge was not romantic. It was mechanical. It kept people alive. A caravan leader who misjudged distance or misread conditions did not get a second chance. His reputation, his income, and often his life depended on his ability to predict what would happen next. The daily structure of a caravan crossing was rigid. Travel began before dawn, when the air was coolest and the animals were rested. The pace was steady, calculated to cover a specific distance before the heat became unmanageable. Midday stops were brief and strategically placed. Afternoon travel resumed only when conditions allowed. Camps were made at locations that had been used many times before, selected for access to water, defensibility, and visibility. Night watches were rotated with precision. Fires were maintained according to need, fuel availability, and the presence of wind. Conversations were limited after dark, not out of superstition, but because sound discipline was a practical consideration in open terrain where bandits, rival groups, or predators might be nearby. Sleep was managed in shifts. No one rested fully. No one ever did. The men who traveled these routes were not prone to panic. They had faced dehydration, extreme heat, injuries, and the occasional confrontation with armed groups attempting to extort or raid supplies. These were known dangers. They had names. They had solutions. A sandstorm could be survived by stopping, covering the animals, and waiting. A spoiled water source meant rationing and adjusting the route to the next known well. Bandits could sometimes be negotiated with or, if necessary, defended against. Fear, in this context, was not an emotion. It was data. It indicated risk. It prompted calculation. It did not prompt storytelling. This is why the appearance of the term Almas in their reports is significant. These were men who did not invent problems. They solved them. If they wrote something down, it was because it could not be solved. If they avoided a route, it was because continuation was not viable. The caravans of 1881 were not isolated. Trade networks were active. Groups passed each other regularly, exchanged information, confirmed conditions. If a route was unsafe due to weather or conflict, the information spread quickly. Merchants adjusted. Guides compared notes. No one traveled blind. The desert they crossed was harsh, but it was understood. It behaved according to patterns. Animals moved in predictable ways. Temperature followed seasonal norms. Wind came from known directions. When these patterns held, the caravan moved with confidence. When they did not, attention sharpened. The first sign of trouble was never dramatic. It was always small. A minor inconsistency. A timing error. A sense that something expected had not occurred. Experienced travelers noticed these deviations immediately, not because they were superstitious, but because survival in the desert depended on noticing when the environment stopped behaving normally. And in the spring of 1881, along several routes crossing the Tian Shan foothills and the northern stretches of the Taklamakan approach, the environment stopped behaving normally. It did not happen all at once. It did not happen to every caravan, but it happened often enough and consistently enough that the reports began to reflect a shared awareness. Something had changed. Not the terrain, not the season, something else. The men writing these reports did not describe the change in emotional terms. They described it in operational terms. Distances felt longer. Nights felt different. Animals behaved unpredictably. Rest stops that had always felt secure no longer did. There was no attack to report. No theft. No confrontation. Just a steady accumulation of small wrong details that, taken together, made continuation feel inadvisable. The caravans adjusted. They always adjusted. But the adjustments in 1881 were not responses to known dangers. They were responses to something the reports did not name directly, as if naming it would require an explanation they were unwilling or unable to provide. What the caravan leaders knew, and what their reports reflect, is that fear is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it arrives not as a threat, but as a pressure. A sense that the rules governing a place have shifted in ways that cannot be mapped or predicted. And when the rules stop working, the professionals stop traveling. The first irregularities were environmental. They were not dramatic. They did not announce themselves. They were noticed only because the men traveling these routes had spent years learning what normal looked like, and these details were not normal. Animal movement stopped following expected patterns. Desert hares, which typically moved at dusk, were absent. Foxes, whose tracks were commonly found near camps, left none. Birds, which usually circled at certain hours searching for carrion or insects, did not appear. This absence was not total. It was localized. Caravans would pass through areas where wildlife seemed to vanish entirely, only to reappear miles later as if nothing had changed. Experienced guides noticed this immediately. Wildlife behavior was a reliable indicator of environmental conditions. Animals avoided areas with poor water, unstable ground, or the scent of predators. But the areas where animals were absent in 1881 had no such explanations. Water sources were intact. The ground was stable. There were no competing predator populations. The animals were simply gone. Sound behaved incorrectly. In open desert, sound carries predictably. Distance, wind, and terrain affect how far a voice or a footstep can be heard, but these effects follow rules. Travelers learn those rules. They learn how far a shout will travel. They learn what silence means. In the affected areas, sound did not follow those rules. Conversations held at normal volume seemed to carry farther than they should have. Footsteps on sand, which should have been nearly silent, seemed amplified. At the same time, sounds that should have been audible, distant movements of animals or the shift of wind through rocks, were absent. The acoustic environment felt inconsistent, as though the air itself had changed density. Temperature fluctuations occurred without apparent cause. Nights in the desert are cold. This is expected. But in the spring of 1881, several caravans reported nights that felt colder than the season allowed, followed by days where the heat arrived later than it should have. These were not extreme changes. They were subtle, but they were noticed because timing in the desert is survival. A caravan that misjudges temperature risks losing animals to exhaustion or traders to heat stroke. What troubled the guides was not that the temperature changed. It was that it changed unpredictably. There was no pattern to learn, no adjustment to make. Just a persistent sense that the environment had become unstable in ways that could not be mapped. Then there was the sensation of presence. This is the detail that appears most often in the reports, described in the most careful language. The writers do not call it fear. They do not call it paranoia. They describe it as awareness. A sense, shared among multiple members of a caravan, that they were being observed. This is not unusual in isolation. Travelers in open terrain often feel exposed. The absence of cover, the wide sky, the emptiness, all of these create a psychological pressure. Experienced travelers account for this. They do not mistake isolation for threat. But the sensation reported in 1881 was not general unease. It was specific. It occurred at certain locations. It occurred at certain times, most often during the late afternoon or early evening, when the light was fading but visibility was still clear. It was described as directional. Not a vague feeling, but a focused sense that attention was being directed toward the caravan from a specific area of elevated terrain or distant ridgeline. The reports do not describe what was seen. In most cases, nothing was seen. The sensation occurred without visual confirmation. Guards scanned the terrain and found nothing. Travelers looked toward the areas where the feeling was strongest and saw only rock and shadow. But the feeling persisted. What makes this detail significant is that it was shared. One person feeling watched can be dismissed as nerves. An entire caravan feeling watched simultaneously from the same direction is harder to explain away. And the men writing these reports were not inclined to report feelings unless those feelings had operational relevance. The relevance became clear when the caravans began altering behavior without discussion. Guards extended their watch shifts. Camps were placed in more defensible positions, even when it meant deviating from established rest points. Fires were kept smaller. Conversations after dark became quieter. No formal orders were given. No leader announced a new policy. The changes occurred naturally, as though every member of the caravan had independently reached the same conclusion. Something required caution. Something required adjustment. And the adjustments were not responses to known threats. Bandits did not operate this way. Predators did not operate this way. Weather did not operate this way. The changes in behavior were responses to something that had no name and no established pattern, which made it impossible to defend against in any concrete way. The desert was failing to behave normally, and the men who had spent their lives learning its behavior had no framework for understanding why. What they did have was experience. They knew that when the environment stops following rules, continuation becomes dangerous. Not because danger is confirmed, but because prediction becomes impossible. And without prediction, every decision becomes a guess. So the caravans adjusted. They moved faster through certain areas. They avoided stopping in places that should have been ideal for rest. They kept watch longer. They spoke less. And when they returned to populated areas and filed their reports, they did not describe these changes as panic. They described them as precaution, as though the need for precaution was self-evident, as though anyone reading the reports would understand exactly what they were being cautious about. What transformed these observations from isolated incidents into a documented pattern was corroboration. Separate caravans, traveling days or even weeks apart, began filing reports that described the same conditions in the same locations. The language varied, but the details aligned with a precision that administrative reviewers found difficult to dismiss. A caravan crossing eastward in early April reported an absence of wildlife along a ridgeline approach approximately 60 miles south of Turpan. The report noted that the usual markers of animal presence, tracks, droppings, evidence of feeding, were absent across a stretch of terrain roughly 12 miles in length. The caravan passed through without incident but noted the deviation as unusual. 3 weeks later, a separate caravan crossing westward along a parallel route filed a report describing the same absence in nearly identical terms. The wildlife had not returned. The stretch of land remained empty. The second report made no reference to the first. The two groups had not communicated. They had simply observed the same thing. This pattern repeated. Multiple groups reported temperature inconsistencies in overlapping areas. Sound distortions were noted by caravans traveling the same paths weeks apart. The sensation of being observed was described by parties with no prior contact, using similar phrasing, referencing the same ridgelines and elevated terrain features. The alignment was not exact. The reports were not identical. But the overlap was too consistent to ignore. The same locations were mentioned repeatedly. The same times of day were referenced. The same behavioral adjustments, extended watches, quieter camps, faster movement through certain zones, were described by groups who had no opportunity to coordinate their responses. This is what gave the reports credibility. If a single caravan had filed a strange account, it could have been dismissed as error or exaggeration. But when multiple independent sources describe the same phenomenon in the same place using restrained, professional language, dismissal becomes harder to justify. The administrative response, however, was not investigation. It was acceptance. The reports were filed. No follow-up inquiries were issued. No official expeditions were organized to examine the areas in question. The information was recorded and allowed to stand without challenge or clarification. This silence is as significant as the reports themselves. It suggests that those receiving the reports understood what was being described, or it suggests that they understood the futility of requesting more detail. The caravans themselves began to communicate informally. When groups passed each other on the routes, conversations turned to conditions ahead. Normally, these exchanges focused on water availability, weather forecasts, and the presence of bandit activity. In the spring and summer of 1881, they began to include warnings about specific stretches of terrain. The warnings were not elaborate. A guide would mention that a certain ridgeline felt wrong, that a particular valley should be passed through quickly, that certain rest points were being avoided. The language remained vague, but the intent was clear. The information being shared was not folklore. It was practical guidance based on recent experience. What made these warnings effective was their restraint. The guides did not embellish. They did not speculate. They simply stated that deviation from the usual route was advisable and left the reasoning implicit. This lack of drama made the warnings more convincing, not less. It signaled that the advice came from judgment, not fear. But the effect was cumulative. As more caravans reported similar experiences, the areas in question began to acquire a reputation. Not as haunted, not as cursed, simply as difficult. As places where the normal rules did not seem to apply and where continuation required more caution than usual. The term Almas began appearing in these informal conversations before it appeared in the written reports. It was used as shorthand, a way to reference the conditions without describing them in detail. A guide might say that a certain area had an Almas problem, and the listener would understand that this meant the area should be avoided or passed through quickly. No further explanation was offered. None was needed. The word itself carried no inherent meaning to outsiders. It was not a term from local folklore. It was not a word that appeared in regional languages with a clear definition. It seemed to function as a label created specifically for this situation, a placeholder for something that could not be easily named. But among those traveling the routes, it became a functional term. It conveyed information. It allowed for communication without requiring detailed description. And its use spread quickly, appearing in reports from different regions, filed by different parties, with no apparent coordination. By mid-1081, the alignment of reports was undeniable. The same areas were being flagged by multiple sources. The same behavioral changes were being described. The same term was being used. And the same outcome was occurring. Routes were being adjusted. Established paths were being modified. In some cases, entire sections of previously reliable routes were being abandoned in favor of longer, less convenient alternatives. This was not done lightly. Desert travel was expensive. Time was money. Deviation from the shortest, most efficient path meant higher costs, longer exposure to the elements, and increased risk to animals and cargo. Merchants did not make these changes without reason. The fact that they made them anyway, based on reports that contain no concrete threat, suggests that the threat was understood to be real enough to justify the cost. The caravans were not fleeing from an attack. They were avoiding the possibility of something worse than an attack. They were avoiding encounters that could not be categorized or defended against. The reports did not describe what would happen if the warnings were ignored. They did not need to. The consistency of the accounts, the professionalism of the language, and the alignment of independent observations created a picture that required no elaboration. Something was present in those areas. Something that multiple groups had encountered or sensed. Something that prompted experienced, skeptical, profit-driven men to alter their routes and accept the financial consequences without complaint. And whatever it was, it did not need to be explained. It only needed to be avoided. Fear does not always announce itself. Among professionals whose survival depends on appearing competent and composed, fear manifests as policy, as procedure, as quiet adjustments that require no justification because their necessity is assumed. This is what occurred throughout the spring and summer of 1881. Caravans began implementing changes to their operations that had no precedent in the established practices of desert travel. These changes were not discussed. They were not debated. They were simply adopted, as though every member of every affected caravan had independently reached the same conclusion about what was necessary. Camps began to be placed differently. For decades, rest points had been selected based on water access, wind protection, and defensibility against human threats. These priorities did not change, but a new consideration was added. Camps were now positioned to maximize visibility in all directions, even when this meant sacrificing shelter or convenience. Open ground was preferred over valleys. Elevated positions were chosen over low-lying areas, despite the increased exposure to wind. The shift was subtle but consistent. Caravans that had once stopped in the same locations for generations began stopping a quarter-mile away, or half-mile away, always choosing positions that offered clearer sight lines. No orders were given. No explanations were recorded. The behavior simply changed. Night watches were extended. Traditionally, watch shifts rotated every few hours to ensure that guards remained alert. This system had proven effective for as long as the routes had existed. But in 1881, guards began staying on watch longer. In some caravans, the rotation stopped entirely. Multiple guards remained awake through the entire night, splitting the responsibility of scanning different directions. This was not sustainable. Extended watches led to exhaustion, which in turn led to mistakes during the day. But the practice continued. The implication was clear. Whatever risk exhaustion created, it was preferable to the risk of reduced vigilance at night. Fires were managed differently. In cold desert nights, fires were a necessity. They provided warmth, light, and a psychological anchor. They also served as signals, marking the location of a camp for other travelers and discouraging predators or opportunistic thieves. Fire management was a well-understood practice. But the fires in 1881 were kept lower. In some cases, they were extinguished entirely after the evening meal, leaving the camps in near total darkness. This was not standard. Darkness made movement difficult and increased the risk of accidents. It also made the camp harder to defend if a threat approached. Yet the practice spread. Caravans that had always maintained fires through the night began letting them die. When asked, guides offered vague explanations. Fuel conservation. Wind conditions. None of the explanations were convincing, and none were pressed. The real reason was understood without being spoken. Silence was enforced more strictly. Conversation after dark had always been limited, but it had never been prohibited. Travelers talked quietly, shared observations, told stories to pass the time. It was a normal part of camp life. In the affected areas, talking stopped. After sunset, the camps became almost completely silent. No orders were issued. No rules were announced. The silence simply settled, as though everyone had agreed without speaking that sound was a risk that could no longer be tolerated. This extended to the animals. Camels and horses were hobbled closer to the center of the camp, within arm's reach of the travelers. Normally, animals were given more space to graze and move. Keeping them too close created noise and discomfort. But in 1881, proximity was prioritized. The animals were kept close enough to be seen and heard at all times. When the animals behaved strangely, the entire camp reacted. A camel pulling against its hobble. A horse shifting repeatedly without settling. These were minor behaviors that would normally be ignored. But in the affected areas, they prompted immediate attention. Guards moved toward the animals. Travelers woke. The camp became alert without anyone issuing a command. This vigilance was exhausting. It created a state of sustained tension that wore down even the most experienced travelers. But it was maintained. No one suggested relaxing the standards. No one argued for a return to the old practices. The adjustments had become the new normal, and the new normal required constant awareness. The behavioral changes were not limited to nights. During the day, caravans moved faster through certain areas. Rest breaks were shortened or skipped entirely. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when the group entered specific stretches of terrain, resuming only after the area had been left behind. Maps were consulted more frequently. Routes were debated in ways they had not been before. Guides who had traveled the same paths for years suddenly began questioning their own decisions, choosing alternate routes that added miles but avoided particular ridgelines or valleys. Merchants accepted these changes without protest. Normally, any deviation that increased travel time or cost would have prompted negotiation or argument. But in 1080-81, the merchants deferred to the guides without question. This deference was itself unusual. It indicated that the concern was not limited to the guides. The entire caravan, from leaders to laborers, shared the same unspoken understanding. Something had changed. The desert had not become more dangerous in any measurable way. There had been no increase in attacks, no new predator population, no environmental disaster. But the feeling of safety had evaporated, and in its absence, every decision became defensive. The adjustments were not solutions. They were accommodations. They acknowledged that something was present without confronting what that something was. They created distance, visibility, and vigilance, but they did not eliminate the pressure. Because the pressure was not coming from a source that could be eliminated. It was environmental. It was constant. And it followed the caravans through certain areas, regardless of what precautions were taken. The changes in behavior were rational responses to an irrational situation. They were the actions of people who understood that their survival depended on taking the threat seriously, even if the threat could not be named or seen. And they were adopted without discussion, because discussion would have required saying out loud what everyone already knew. Something was watching, and no adjustment they made was going to stop it. There is a caravan report dated May 17, 1881, that stands apart from the others. It is longer. It contains more detail. And it describes the moment when passive observation became undeniable presence. The caravan in question was a mid-sized group of 18 travelers and 32 animals, crossing a route southeast of Urumqi toward the trading town of Hami. The leader was a man named Osman, a veteran of the route with more than 20 years of experience. His reports prior to May had been brief and factual, consistent with his reputation for competence and restraint. The report from May 17th is different. It begins with an abrupt statement that the caravan had stopped earlier than planned and would not resume travel until morning. This deviation was significant. The planned rest point was still hours ahead, at a location with reliable water. Stopping early meant camping without confirmed access to a well, a decision that violated basic operational logic. Osman does not explain the decision immediately. Instead, he describes the hours leading up to it. The caravan had been traveling through an area of low foothills, terrain that offered moderate cover and manageable elevation changes. The weather was clear. Visibility was excellent. The group had been making good time and was expected to reach the planned rest point by mid-evening. At approximately 3 hours before sunset, the caravan entered a stretch of terrain where the foothills formed a natural corridor. The path was well established. It had been used for years. There was nothing about the location that should have caused concern. But the animals began behaving strangely. The camels slowed without prompting. Several refused to move forward and had to be coaxed. The horses became skittish, turning their heads repeatedly toward the ridgeline to the east. One horse broke from the line entirely and had to be retrieved. The travelers noticed the change immediately. Animal behavior was a primary indicator of danger. When animals reacted, experienced guides paid attention. Osman called a brief halt to assess the situation. The guards scanned the ridgeline. Nothing was visible. No movement. No shapes. No dust indicating travel. The terrain was empty, but the feeling was not empty. Osman describes it in careful terms. He writes that the group felt observed, not by a single individual, but by sustained attention from an elevated position. The sensation was strong enough that multiple travelers independently turned to look at the same ridgeline without coordinating their movements. This is a critical detail. When a group of people, without speaking, turns to face the same direction, it suggests that the sensation they are experiencing is not psychological. It is responsive to something external, even if that something is not visible. Osman ordered the caravan to continue moving. There was no tactical reason to stop in the corridor. If something was present, remaining stationary made them more vulnerable, not less. The group resumed travel, moving faster than before. The feeling did not diminish. It followed them. As the caravan moved through the corridor, the sensation of observation moved with them, maintaining a consistent position along the ridgeline to the east. Travelers reported that the attention felt directional and deliberate, as though whatever was observing them was tracking their movement and adjusting its position to maintain line of sight. No one saw anything. The ridgeline remained empty, but the certainty among the travelers was absolute. Something was there. Something was keeping pace with them, and something was watching. This continued for more than an hour. The corridor stretched longer than expected, or seemed to. Several travelers later reported that the distance felt incorrect, as though the landscape had extended in a way that violated their memory of the route. Osman does not confirm this in his report, but he does note that the group traveled for longer than anticipated before clearing the corridor. When they finally emerged into open terrain, the feeling stopped. Not gradually, abruptly. The pressure lifted all at once, as though a boundary had been crossed. Osman called an immediate halt. It was still several hours from the planned rest point, but he made the decision to stop anyway. He does not provide a justification in the report. He does not cite fatigue, animal welfare, or tactical concerns. He simply states that the caravan stopped and would not resume travel until morning. The camp that night was silent. Fires were lit but kept low. Guards were posted on all sides, facing outward. No one slept deeply. The animals remained restless through the night, shifting and pulling at their hobbles despite the absence of any visible threat. Osman describes the night as long. He does not elaborate, but the implication is clear. The caravan spent the night waiting, not for an attack, not for a sound, just waiting because the feeling that had followed them through the corridor had not entirely disappeared. It had diminished, but it had not gone away. At dawn, the caravan resumed travel without incident. The planned rest point was reached by mid-morning. Water was plentiful. The remainder of the crossing proceeded normally, but Osman's report includes a final detail that separates it from all previous accounts. He writes that the caravan would not use that route again. He does not frame this as a recommendation. He states it as fact. The route, which had been in regular use for years, would be avoided. And it was. Subsequent caravans led by Osman took longer paths that bypassed the corridor entirely. Other guides, upon hearing about the experience, made the same choice. Within weeks, the route had been effectively abandoned, not through official decree but through collective refusal. The report does not describe what was seen. It does not speculate about what caused the sensation. It does not use the term Almas, though later references to the incident would. What it does is document the moment when the presence shifted from passive to active, when observation became pursuit, when the feeling of being watched became undeniable enough that an experienced, rational professional chose to abandon an established route rather than risk a second encounter. The significance of Osman's report is not in what it claims. It is in who wrote it. Osman was not prone to exaggeration. He had no reason to fabricate a problem. His income depended on completing crossings efficiently. Abandoning a route cost him time and money. The fact that he did it anyway signals that the experience was severe enough to override professional and financial incentives. It was credible enough to influence the behavior of other guides who had not personally experienced the encounter. And it was consistent enough with other reports that no one questioned his decision. After May 17th, the pattern of reports changed. The term Almas began appearing more frequently. The language remained restrained, but the implications became darker. The presence was no longer ambient. It was focused. It was aware. And it was willing to follow. By the summer of 1881, the term Almas had become functional language among caravan guides and traders operating in the affected regions. It appeared in written reports with increasing frequency. It was spoken in camps and trading posts. It was used to communicate risk without requiring explanation, but it was never defined. No report describes what an Almas looked like. No account provides physical characteristics. Height, build, coloring, movement patterns, none of these details appear in the surviving documents. The omission is so consistent that it cannot be accidental. It suggests either that no one saw the Almas clearly enough to describe it, or that description was deliberately avoided. The word itself does not appear to have originated from local languages in the region. Linguists, examining the term more than a century later, found no clear etymology. It does not correspond to known words in Uyghur, Mongolian, Kazakh, or the regional dialects spoken along the trade routes. It seems to have been adopted specifically for the encounters of 1881, a label created to fill a gap in the existing vocabulary. What the term accomplished was efficiency. When a guide said that an area had an Almas problem, other guides understood the implication immediately. The area should be avoided. If avoidance was not possible, precaution should be maximized. The risk was not from weather, bandits, or animals. It was from something else. Something that required a different kind of caution. The word functioned as a warning without requiring justification. This made it useful in professional contexts where time and clarity were essential. A merchant could ask if a route was clear, and a guide could answer that it passed through Almas country. No further discussion was necessary. The merchant would understand that the route carried a risk that could not be mitigated through normal means, and decisions would be made accordingly. But the lack of definition created a problem for outsiders. Colonial administrators, European travelers, and researchers attempting to understand the reports found the term frustratingly vague. Requests for clarification were either ignored or met with responses that provided no additional detail. The caravan leaders and guides who used the term seemed unwilling or unable to elaborate. This has led to speculation that the term was deliberately kept vague to avoid ridicule or dismissal. That those who used it understood that describing the Almas in concrete terms would invite skepticism, so they chose instead to leave it undefined and allow the consistency of the reports to speak for itself. But there is another possibility. The term may have been left vague because precision was impossible, because the encounters did not provide enough visual information to allow for detailed description, because what was experienced was presence and observation rather than direct sighting. In several reports, the language used to reference the Almas is carefully indirect. A guide might write that a certain area is known to be problematic, without stating what makes it problematic, or that a route should be avoided during certain hours, without explaining why. The term Almas appears as context, not subject. It is referenced in passing, as though the reader already knows what it means. This indirect language is consistent across multiple sources. It suggests that those writing the reports assumed their audience would need no introduction to the term, that the Almas had become common enough knowledge among those operating in the region that explicit definition was unnecessary. But this also meant that the knowledge remained localized. Outside the community of caravan traders and desert guides, the term had no meaning. And because the community itself refused to define it, the term became a barrier to understanding rather than a tool for communication. The effect of this was that routes began to be abandoned without clear documentation of why. Merchants from outside the region, unfamiliar with the term and its implications, continued to plan crossings through areas that local guides refused to enter. This created friction. Contracts were broken. Disputes arose. In some cases, caravans were forced to proceed through contested areas with guides who lacked the experience or local knowledge to navigate safely. These forced crossings sometimes resulted in new reports that aligned with the existing pattern. The term Almas would appear again, this time written by someone encountering it for the first time, often with a tone of confusion or disbelief. But the details would match. The sensation of observation, the behavioral changes among animals, the decision to increase speed or alter course without clear justification. Over time, the term spread beyond the immediate region. It appeared in reports from areas farther south, along routes crossing the Taklamakan margins. It appeared in correspondence from Russian military observers stationed near the northern trade corridors. In each case, the term was used without definition, as though it had already been explained elsewhere. But it had not been explained. It had simply been adopted. And the adoption was based not on folklore or legend, but on repeated first-hand experience, documented by multiple independent sources. The absence of a clear definition did not make the term less credible. In some ways, it made it more credible. Folklore provides detail. It gives monsters names, shapes, and motivations. The Almas had none of that. It was a blank space in the reports, a term used to mark the presence of something that could not be easily categorized. This blankness is what makes the accounts unsettling. They describe a shared experience that was real enough to alter behavior and ruin routes, but not clear enough to be described in concrete terms. The witnesses were not unreliable. They were professionals whose survival depended on accurate observation. But what they observed resisted description. By the end of the summer, the term Almas had become embedded in the operational language of Central Asian desert trade. It appeared in route assessments, contract negotiations, and safety briefings. It was treated as a known variable, something to be planned around rather than investigated. And it remained undefined. Not because the truth was being hidden, but because there was no truth to hide. Only a pattern of encounters that defied easy explanation, and a term created to allow those encounters to be referenced without requiring the impossible task of making them make sense. What made the encounters of 1881 particularly disturbing was not their intensity, but their consistency. The Almas did not attack. It did not approach. It did not escalate. It simply remained present, recurring across multiple sightings with a sameness that suggested pattern rather than coincidence. Caravans traveling through the affected regions reported seeing movement on distant ridge lines. The movement was upright. It was described as human-like in posture, though never close enough for detail to be confirmed. It appeared at the edges of visibility, far enough away that identification was impossible, but close enough that the shape was unmistakable. These sightings occurred in daylight. They were not shadows or tricks of failing light. They were observed during the late afternoon, when the sun was still high and the air was clear. Travelers would glance toward elevated terrain and see a figure standing or moving along the ridgeline, visible for a few moments before disappearing behind rock or distance. The figures did not wave. They did not signal. They did not approach or retreat in response to being seen. They simply moved parallel to the caravan, maintaining distance, appearing intermittently as the terrain allowed. What unsettled the travelers was the repetition. A caravan might see the figure once, dismiss it as a solitary herder or traveler, and continue moving. But then the figure would appear again, miles later, in a different location, but at the same relative distance. And then again, and again. The persistence suggested tracking. Not pursuit, but observation. As though the figure was following the caravan without intending to close the distance, content to remain at the edge of visibility and simply watch. Attempts to approach the figures were unsuccessful. In 2 documented cases, guards were sent to investigate the ridgelines where the figures had been seen. The guards found nothing. No tracks. No signs of passage. No indication that anyone had been standing in the locations where the figures were observed. This absence of evidence was more disturbing than confirmation would have been. It meant that either the figures were not real, which the guards refused to believe given the clarity of the sightings, or the figures were capable of moving across terrain without leaving traces, which implied a level of skill or intent that made them more dangerous, not less. The sensation of being followed became routine. Caravans traveling through certain areas expected it. They planned for it. Guards were assigned to watch specific directions. Travelers were told not to acknowledge the figures if they appeared, a rule that emerged organically and was followed without question. The logic behind the rule was never stated, but the implication was understood. Acknowledgement might invite interaction. And interaction, whatever form it took, was to be avoided. The lack of escalation made the encounters difficult to categorize. There was no violence, no theft, no direct confrontation. The presence was passive in action but active in effect. It wore down the travelers. It created exhaustion that was psychological rather than physical. Men who had spent decades crossing the desert without fear began showing signs of strain. Experienced guides became irritable. Decisions were questioned. Arguments broke out over minor issues. The cohesion that normally held a caravan together began to fray, not because of external attack, but because of sustained pressure that had no clear source or resolution. Animals continued to behave unpredictably. Camels refused to move through certain areas, even when coaxed or driven. Horses shied at empty terrain, reacting as though something was present that the travelers could not see. The animals did not panic. They simply resisted, forcing the caravan to adjust course or slow down. This resistance was costly. Time lost to animal management meant longer exposure to the elements. Delays compounded. Water reserves were stretched. The efficiency that desert travel depended on eroded, replaced by a grinding uncertainty that made every decision more difficult. But still, nothing attacked. Nothing approached. The presence remained distant and observational, never crossing the invisible boundary that separated passive watching from active threat. This restraint was itself a form of pressure. It suggested awareness. Intent. As though whatever was following the caravans understood that pursuit was unnecessary. That distance and persistence were enough. Some travelers began to report dreams. Not nightmares in the traditional sense, but repetitive, oppressive imagery that recurred night after night. Dreams of being watched. Dreams of walking through empty terrain while something kept pace just out of sight. The dreams were not violent. They were simply exhausting. Travelers woke feeling as though they had not rested. These reports were not universal. Not every member of every caravan experienced the dreams. But enough did that the pattern was noted. And the pattern aligned with the waking experience. The sense of observation did not end at sunset. It continued through the night, manifesting as unease that prevented deep sleep and left the travelers drained by morning. Mistakes began to occur. Minor errors that would normally be caught and corrected. A miscalculation of distance. A failure to secure a load properly. A guard falling asleep during a watch shift. These were not catastrophic failures, but they were accumulations of small breakdowns that indicated declining function. The caravan leaders recognized the signs. They knew that exhaustion led to poor judgment, and poor judgment in the desert led to death. But they also knew that the source of the exhaustion could not be addressed through rest or discipline. The problem was environmental, and the environment could not be negotiated with or escaped, only endured. So the caravans continued moving. They pressed through the affected areas as quickly as possible, minimizing time spent in zones where the presence was strongest. They accepted the inefficiency. They accepted the cost. Because the alternative, stopping or slowing down, felt more dangerous than continuation. The repeated presence without escalation created a unique form of dread. It was not the sharp fear of immediate danger. It was the slow, grinding awareness that something was wrong and would remain wrong for as long as the caravan remained in the area. It was the knowledge that every hour spent in Almas country was an hour spent under observation, with no understanding of what the observation meant or what it might lead to. And because there was no escalation, there was no resolution. The encounters did not build to a climax. They simply repeated, day after day, until the caravan finally cleared the affected area and the presence stopped. But the memory remained, and the knowledge that the route would have to be crossed again, eventually, if trade was to continue. For many, that knowledge was enough. They chose different work, different routes, different lives. Anything to avoid returning to the places where the Almas had been felt. Because the presence, though passive, had made one thing clear. It was not going away. And it did not need to do anything more than watch to make continuation unbearable. There is an account from late August 1881 that represents the breaking point. It describes a caravan that entered Almas country and did not emerge on the other side. Not because it was destroyed, but because it turned back. The caravan was larger than most, 26 travelers with 47 animals, carrying textiles and metalwork from Kashgar toward the markets of Turpan. The leader was a man named Mehmet, a trader with extensive experience and a reputation for completing contracts regardless of conditions. His decision to turn back was so out of character that the account was initially questioned by those who knew him. But the account stands. And the details it contains are among the most specific in the entire collection of 1,881 reports. The caravan entered the contested region on August 20th. The route was known to pass through Almas country, but Mehmet had crossed it before without incident. He believed the risks were manageable. The group was large. The season was favorable. There was no reason to expect failure. The first day passed without event. The caravan covered the expected distance and made camp at a familiar rest point. Guards were posted. Watches were rotated normally. The night was quiet. The second day began to show signs of trouble. The animals were slow to rise and resistant to being loaded. 2 camels refused their feed, which was unusual. The horses were skittish, requiring more time than normal to settle into the traveling formation. But the caravan moved. Progress was slower than planned, but not alarmingly so. Mehmet attributed the delays to the heat and pushed the group to make up time during the cooler afternoon hours. It was during the afternoon that the sightings began. Multiple travelers reported seeing figures on the ridgelines to the north. The figures were upright, human-like in shape, and moving parallel to the caravan. They appeared intermittently, visible for a few moments before disappearing behind terrain features. This was consistent with previous reports. Mehmet did not consider it grounds to stop. He ordered the guards to remain alert and the caravan to maintain pace. But the figures did not remain on the northern ridgeline. By late afternoon, travelers reported seeing similar shapes to the south, and then to the east. The figures were appearing from multiple directions, maintaining the same distance, but surrounding the caravan in a loose, shifting perimeter. This was new. Previous encounters had described observation from a single direction. The appearance of figures from multiple sides suggested coordination, or it suggested that there were more of them than anyone had previously understood. Mehmet called a halt. The caravan formed a tighter group. Guards were repositioned to cover all directions. The decision was made to camp early, despite being miles short of the planned rest point. The camp that night was tense. Fires were kept burning. Guards remained awake in shifts that covered the entire night. No one spoke unnecessarily. The animals were restless, pulling at their hobbles and calling out intermittently, a behavior that kept the entire camp on edge. And the figures remained visible. Even in the darkness, travelers reported seeing movement at the edges of the firelight. Shapes that stood upright. Shapes that did not approach, but did not leave. Shapes that seemed to shift position when not being directly observed, closing the distance in increments too small to justify alarm, but too consistent to dismiss. No one slept. The night stretched. Time felt distorted, as though the hours were passing more slowly than they should. Several travelers later reported that they checked the stars repeatedly, confused by how little the sky had rotated despite the sensation that significant time had passed. At dawn, the figures were gone. The perimeter was empty, but the sense of presence had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified. The air felt thick. The light felt wrong. The terrain, which should have been familiar, seemed subtly altered, as though the landscape had shifted during the night in ways that could not be precisely identified. Mehmet ordered the caravan to resume travel. The plan was to push through the affected area as quickly as possible and reach safer terrain by nightfall. The group moved faster than usual, sacrificing caution for speed. But the day did not proceed as planned. Distances felt incorrect. Landmarks that should have been reached by midday did not appear until late afternoon. The terrain seemed to resist forward progress, forcing detours around obstacles that had not been present on previous crossings. The figures reappeared. They were closer now. Still distant, but close enough that detail began to emerge. Travelers described seeing the shapes of heads, shoulders, limbs. The figures moved with a gait that was almost human but not quite. Smooth, deliberate, unnervingly fluid across terrain that should have required careful footing. By mid-afternoon, the animals began to fail. A camel collapsed without warning, its legs folding beneath it. The animal was not injured. It was not dehydrated. It simply stopped moving, as though it had decided that continuation was not possible. 2 more camels went down within the hour. The horses refused to proceed past a certain point, turning back toward the direction the caravan had come from and resisting all attempts to redirect them. Mehmet made the decision. The caravan would turn back, not retreat to the previous night's camp, but withdraw entirely from the region. The crossing would not be completed. The contracts would be broken. The financial loss would be significant. But continuation was no longer viable. The animals could not be forced forward. The terrain was no longer predictable. And the figures, which had remained distant for so long, were beginning to close the perimeter. The caravan turned and began moving back along the route it had traveled. The moment the direction changed, the animals responded. The camels that had collapsed rose to their feet. The horses stopped resisting. The pace quickened without being driven. And the figures stopped following. They remained visible on the ridgelines for a time, but they did not pursue. They simply watched as the caravan withdrew, their presence diminishing as the distance increased. By nightfall, the caravan had cleared the affected area. The sense of pressure lifted. The animals settled. The travelers, though exhausted, felt the return of something that had been absent for 2 days. A sense of normalcy, of safety. Mehmet filed his report 3 days later. It is detailed, methodical, and devoid of exaggeration. He describes the decision to turn back as tactical, not emotional. He cites the failure of the animals, the distortion of distance, and the increasing proximity of the observed figures as factors that made continuation impossible. He does not use the term Almas in the report, but he references it in the summary, noting that the route passes through country known to be problematic and recommending that future crossings avoid the area entirely or proceed only with significantly larger groups and increased precautions. The recommendation was followed. The route was abandoned. Mehmet's reputation, rather than being damaged by the failure, was reinforced. Other traders recognized that his decision to turn back demonstrated judgment rather than weakness. A man who completed every crossing regardless of conditions was reckless. A man who recognized when continuation was no longer viable was competent. The account is significant because it describes escalation. The presence that had been passive and distant became active and proximate. The figures that had remained on the ridgelines began to descend. The observation that had been tolerable became unbearable. And the only response that proved effective was withdrawal. Not confrontation. Not persistence. Simply leaving. The implication was clear. The Almas, whatever it was, controlled certain areas. And those who entered those areas did so at the sufferance of something that could, if it chose, make continuation impossible. Mehmet never crossed that route again, and within a year, neither did anyone else. By the autumn of 1881, certain routes that had been in continuous use for decades were no longer being traveled. There were no official announcements, no government decrees closing the paths, no formal warnings issued by trade guilds or regional authorities. The routes simply stopped appearing in caravan schedules. Merchants stopped offering contracts for crossings. Guides stopped accepting work in the affected areas. The change was quiet but absolute. Maps continued to show the routes as viable. Historical records documented their use going back generations. The terrain had not changed. Water sources remained accessible. The physical infrastructure required for desert travel was intact, but the routes were abandoned. This abandonment represented a significant economic and logistical disruption. The routes in question were not minor paths. They were established trade corridors that connected major markets. Avoiding them meant accepting longer travel times, higher costs, and increased exposure to other risks. Merchants who depended on efficient transport saw their margins shrink. Regional economies that relied on consistent trade flow experienced strain. But the costs were accepted without public complaint. Traders chose alternate routes and absorbed the losses. They did not petition authorities for intervention. They did not organize expeditions to reclaim the abandoned paths. They simply adjusted their operations and moved on. The silence surrounding these decisions is as significant as the decisions themselves. It suggests that the reason for the abandonment was understood widely enough that explanation was unnecessary, or that explanation was considered inadvisable. In some cases, the avoidance extended beyond the routes themselves. Entire regions began to be bypassed. Caravans that had once stopped at certain oases or trading posts began skipping them entirely, even when this meant traveling longer distances without rest. The affected locations were not damaged or depleted. They remained functional, but they were no longer used. Local populations in these areas noticed the change. Small communities that had depended on caravan traffic for income and supplies found themselves isolated. Some adapted by relocating closer to the new routes. Others persisted, continuing to maintain rest points and trading posts that saw fewer and fewer visitors as the months passed. But even these local populations did not question the change openly. There was no campaign to draw travelers back. No effort to reassure merchants that the routes were safe. The silence was mutual, as though everyone involved recognized that the situation could not be resolved through persuasion or incentive. The routes remained on maps for years. Cartographers continued to include them in updated editions, either unaware of the change or unwilling to acknowledge it. This created a discrepancy between documented infrastructure and actual practice. A traveler consulting a map might plan a crossing through an area that local guides would refuse to enter. This discrepancy occasionally led to conflict. Merchants unfamiliar with the region would hire guides based on mapped routes, only to be told upon arrival that the planned path was no longer viable. Contracts were disputed. Guides were accused of incompetence or deception. But the guides held firm. They would not enter the affected areas, and they offered no detailed explanation for their refusal. Over time, the knowledge became more widely distributed. Traders learned to ask specific questions when planning crossings. Is the route active? Is it currently being used? Are there known problems? The questions were indirect, but the answers were clear. Routes that passed through Almas country were not active. They were not being used. And yes, there were known problems. The economic impact of the abandonment was measurable. Trade volumes between certain markets declined. Prices increased due to longer transport times. Some goods became less available in regions that had previously received regular supply, but these impacts were absorbed. The system adapted. New routes were established. New agreements were negotiated. What was not established was any formal record of why the old routes had been abandoned. The administrative silence remained intact. The reports that documented the encounters of 1881 were filed, but not acted upon. No investigations were launched. No efforts were made to reclaim the routes or address the conditions that had led to their disuse. This suggests that the authorities who received the reports made a calculated decision. They chose not to challenge the situation. They chose not to demand explanation or evidence. They chose to accept the abandonment as a fait accompli and allow the trade networks to reorganize around the new reality. The choice reflects a kind of pragmatic acknowledgement. Whatever was happening in the affected areas, it was severe enough that experienced professionals refused to continue working there. It was consistent enough that multiple independent sources had reached the same conclusion. And it was unresolvable enough that intervention was not considered a viable option. So the routes were left empty. The terrain remained, the infrastructure remained, but the human presence that had sustained the routes for generations withdrew, leaving behind a network of paths that were perfectly functional but entirely unused. Over the following years, the abandoned routes began to fade from practice entirely. Younger guides, trained on the new paths, had no personal memory of the old ones. Merchants who had once relied on the original corridors adjusted their operations to the point where the old routes were no longer even considered as alternatives. The abandonment became normalized. The routes transitioned from active to historical to forgotten, and the reason for their disuse transitioned from immediate concern to context to silence. By the end of the decade, the routes were effectively erased from operational use. They remained on old maps. They appeared in historical accounts, but they were no longer part of the living network of trade and travel. And the Almas, which had never been described, explained, or resolved, remained associated with the empty terrain, a presence that had changed the geography not by altering the land, but by making it intolerable to cross. The reports from 1881 do not conclude with resolution. They do not describe a final encounter, a definitive sighting, or an explanation that brings clarity to the events. They simply stop. The term Almas continues to appear in scattered references for a few years afterward, but the detailed accounts, the operational reports, the first-hand descriptions, these end abruptly in the autumn of 1881. This is not because the phenomenon ceased. It is because the routes where it occurred were no longer being traveled. When the caravans stopped crossing the affected terrain, the reports stopped being filed. The encounters did not end. The documentation ended. This distinction is important. It means that the silence in the historical record does not indicate resolution. It indicates avoidance. The problem was not solved. It was bypassed. Researchers examining the records decades later noted this abrupt termination. They searched for follow-up investigations, official inquiries, or attempts to revisit the affected areas. None were found. The administrative response to the 1881 reports was acceptance, not action. The routes were allowed to fall out of use without intervention. This lack of follow-up is unusual. Colonial powers operating in the region during this period were typically aggressive in asserting control over trade routes and ensuring access to economically valuable areas. Abandoned routes represented lost revenue and diminished influence. The failure to reclaim them suggests that the authorities recognized the situation as one that could not be addressed through conventional means. The Almas was referenced in later reports, but always as context, never as subject. A military surveyor in 1884 noted that certain terrain was avoided by local guides due to historical problems, using phrasing that implied familiarity with the 1081 accounts. A Russian explorer in 1887 mentioned in passing that some areas were considered impassable, not due to physical obstacles, but due to persistent local concerns that he did not elaborate on. These references are brief and indirect. They suggest that the knowledge of the Almas remained within the communities that had experienced it, but that the knowledge was not being actively transmitted or documented. It had become localized understanding, the kind of information that guides shared with each other but did not explain to outsiders. Scholars examining the accounts in the 20th century found the lack of descriptive detail frustrating. They noted that the reports contained almost no physical descriptions, no behavioral observations, and no attempts to categorize or explain the phenomenon. The witnesses, who were otherwise meticulous in their documentation of terrain, weather, and logistics, became vague and evasive when describing the Almas itself. Some researchers interpreted this as evidence of folklore contamination, arguing that the accounts were influenced by regional myths and should not be taken literally. But this interpretation struggles to account for the consistency of the reports, the professionalism of the witnesses, and the significant economic consequences of the route abandonments. Other researchers suggested that the lack of detail was intentional, a form of protective silence meant to avoid ridicule or official skepticism. This explanation is more plausible but still incomplete. It does not explain why the silence was so uniform across multiple independent sources, or why even private correspondence from the period contains the same evasiveness. A third possibility is that the witnesses could not provide more detail because more detail did not exist. That the encounters were characterized not by clear sightings but by sustained ambiguity. That what was experienced was presence without form, observation without identity. And that the restraint in the reports reflects not a reluctance to describe, but an inability to describe with precision. This possibility aligns with the nature of the accounts. They describe sensation, pressure, behavioral changes in animals, and the decision to withdraw. They do not describe creatures, attacks, or confrontations. The Almas remains a negative space in the reports, defined by what it caused rather than what it was. The accounts end where they do because the people who could have continued documenting them chose not to return. The caravan leaders, the guides, the traders, they withdrew from the affected areas and redirected their work elsewhere. The knowledge they carried remained with them, but it was no longer being recorded because the situations that prompted recording were being avoided. This creates a historical dead end. The accounts exist as fragments, detailed enough to be credible but incomplete enough to resist conclusion. They document a pattern of encounters that altered trade routes, influenced economic decisions, and left a permanent mark on regional geography. but they do so without ever fully explaining what was encountered. The silence that follows the 1881 reports is not the silence of resolution. It is the silence of withdrawal. The phenomenon was not defeated or understood. It was left alone. And the areas it inhabited were left empty, avoided by those who remembered and forgotten by those who did not. What remains is a collection of restrained, professional accounts that describe something real enough to ruin roots, credible enough to influence experienced professionals, but ambiguous enough that it resists definition more than a century later. The accounts end where they do because continuation required proximity. And proximity, for reasons the witnesses could not or would not fully articulate, had become impossible. The caravans of 1881 did not defeat the Almas. They did not drive it away. They did not uncover its nature or develop strategies to neutralize it. They simply stopped going to the places where it was felt. This is the central fact of the accounts. The resolution was geographic, not tactical. The problem was solved by removing human presence from the affected areas, not by removing the presence from the areas themselves. This response reflects a kind of understanding that does not require explanation. The guides and traders who made the decision to abandon the routes did not need to articulate why continuation was impossible. They understood it in the same way that someone understands when a structure is unsound or when weather has made a path impassable. The knowledge was immediate and certain, even if it could not be expressed in clear terms. What the accounts describe is not a battle. It is a negotiation conducted through proximity and withdrawal. The caravans entered certain terrain and felt observation. The observation became pressure. The pressure became unbearable. And when it did, the caravans left. The negotiation ended not with victory, but with recognition that the terrain belonged to something else. This recognition is implicit in every account. The Almas was not driven from the ridgelines. It was not hunted or confronted. It was acknowledged as a presence that had claim to specific areas, and those areas were ceded without contest. The lack of confrontation is significant. These were not passive men. They were professionals who regularly dealt with threats through direct action. Bandits were fought or negotiated with. Predators were driven off or killed. Weather was endured, but the Almas was avoided. This suggests that confrontation was not considered viable, that the presence, whatever it was, did not present itself in a way that allowed for tactical response. There was nothing to fight, nothing to chase, nothing to defend against. Only a persistent awareness that continuation would lead somewhere the travelers were not willing to go. The animals understood this before the humans did. Their refusal to proceed, their restlessness, their fear, these were not responses to immediate danger. They were responses to the wrongness of the environment, to the sense that the rules governing safe passage had been suspended. The humans eventually reached the same conclusion. But where the animals responded instinctively, the humans responded through deliberation and collective agreement. The decision to turn back, to abandon routes, to accept financial loss, these were rational choices made by people who understood that some situations cannot be resolved through persistence. What was avoided was not a creature. It was a condition. A state of being observed and followed by something that maintained distance but refused to leave. A presence that could make terrain intolerable without ever becoming visible or tangible enough to be confronted. The reports reflect this understanding. They describe the effects of the presence without describing the presence itself. They document the decision to withdraw without framing withdrawal as failure. And they leave the phenomenon unresolved, not because resolution was impossible, but because resolution required continuation, and continuation had become unbearable. The Almas was never described because description was not the point. The point was survival. And survival in this case meant leaving. The terrain the caravans abandoned remains. The ridgelines are still there. The valleys, the corridors, the rest points, all of it still exists. The routes could theoretically be used again. The infrastructure has not decayed. The physical barriers have not increased. But the routes remain empty. Even now, more than a century later, the areas associated with the 1881 encounters are not heavily traveled. Modern roads bypass them. Settlements remain sparse. The land is accessible but avoided, as though the memory of what happened there has outlasted the generations that experienced it. This persistence of avoidance suggests that the accounts captured something real, not a story, not a legend, but a pattern of encounters that was severe enough to alter human geography in ways that have not been reversed. The caravans of 1881 encountered something in the desert. They documented it in restrained, professional language. They adjusted their routes to avoid it. And then they stopped talking about it, because talking required returning, and returning was not an option they were willing to consider. The Almas was avoided, not confronted. And the silence that followed was not the silence of resolution, but the silence of distance. The silence of people who had seen enough to know that some things are not meant to be understood, only survived. And sometimes, not even that. Sometimes, the only option is to leave, and to let the empty places remain empty.